Okay. So today we are working on hips and quads. So if you have a foam roller, get that. We're going to be using a tennis ball a lot today. But we're going to start with our same warm-up that we did last time, go through all the different areas of the body. We're going to start with feet. We're going to do hamstrings, and then we're going to move on to quads and hips. So let's start with our foot warm-up. If you have a foot roller or a tennis ball, you can start with that. If you'd like to start with the foot massage too, you can start with that also, up to you. How's everybody feeling? Thumbs up if you're feeling good, thumbs down if you're feeling sore. Sore-ish. Some people yes, some people no. Yeah. Week 3 can be pretty hard on your body. So this is probably one of the times when you will need to roll out the most. So if you've been massaging your foot with your hands and you have a foot roller, go ahead and switch to your foot roller. If not, you can keep rolling out. And if you have a tennis ball, you can roll side to side. You can also roll back and forth if that feels better. But rolling side to side is very helpful. And let's go ahead and just do some stretches for our demi point and our foot. Switching between the demi point and over the foot. And when you're done with that, go ahead and start working on your other foot. You might want to start with a little massage, or you can go straight to your foot roller. And let's go ahead and switch to foot roller. Then on the floor, you have one. And when you're ready, if you like, go ahead and switch to tennis ball. If you have one. Roll side to side, forward back. Sometimes your tennis ball will want to run away from you, like mine. Sometimes you have to stabilize it. And go ahead and give yourself a little stretch over the arch and over the metatarsal. And before we go into our calves, let's actually just test our range and our hamstrings and our hips today. We're going to be paying extra attention to the hips, but just see how you feel in the different stretches. One leg to the side, one leg to the other side. Maybe test both legs. And you can test a lunge. Knee down, knee up. See how that feels. Make sure you test both sides. And test your pigeon. Both sides. And now I want you to test a couple things we haven't really done before. Test your butterfly, your range here. And then either whatever you like to do better, the fire log stretch or the fully crossed glute stretch. Test your range there. And we're going to test one more stretch for the hips. So go ahead and go into a lunge and then turn inward. You should feel a stretch in your glute. So turn towards the knee that's up, yeah. And just see how that feels and then test the other side so that you're even. All right. So keep that in your mind as we're rolling out what all those stretches felt like. What felt good, what felt bad, what felt tight, what felt loose. And we're gonna see how what we do affects that. So calves, if you have a stick, go ahead and use that. If not, go ahead and massage the inner line of your calf with your hands. So we'll start with the inner line of the calves today, then we'll do the middle, and then the outside. And you can go at your own pace a little bit. If you feel like the inside doesn't need that much work, you can move to the middle a little bit sooner. And for everyone who's been doing the middle line or inside line, let's move to the middle, right behind the calf. And let's go ahead and move to the outside. So just as a quick reminder for those of you who don't have a massage stick, if you do have a foam roller, you can also use this to massage the inside, the middle, and the outside. Or you can use your hands, of course, you can knead with your hands, or if you have massage oil, you can push with the palm of your hand upwards, palm of your hand upwards, and use both hands to get along the back. A few different ways you can do that. You can also use a tennis ball if you like, along the back or along the side. That works too. Just find what works for you. Another thing that I'm not sure I talked about with you guys is if your calves are really tight in the area under the belly of the muscle, so not this area up here, but sort of the area around the Achilles tendon, you can use a tennis ball and you can go just under the calf where there's sort of a shelf in your leg. So there's this big part and then there's the narrow part. So right where that meets, you can take a tennis ball and you can just roll back and forth. And sometimes that helps with the tension. Let's go ahead and move to our other leg. Starting with the inner line. And again, you can use your foam roller for this. You can use a tennis ball for this, whatever works best for you. And let's switch to the middle line. And when you're ready, switch to the outer line. And if you have a tennis ball, just go ahead and try the one under the cap and see how that works for you. Side to side. And when you're done with that, let's stand up and give the calves a little stretch. And you can stretch with the bent leg as well. Stretch out the Achilles tendon. You can alternate between stretch and bent. And if you want, you can see how your feet feel again. Mine feel better after I roll out my calves usually. All right, and now we're going to move on to hamstrings. So before we do that, it actually, let's see how we're doing on time. We're good. I actually want to have everybody come to the computer or whatever device you're using. Sorry, iPad is being weird. And let me know what works best for your hamstrings when you roll it out. Which line? Remember, we talked about the 3 lines of the hamstring, and then the gracilis and the IT band as sort of the 5th and 4th lines. You can also type in if you feel like none of them worked for you very well. The outer line, IT band, inner. And you guys can do this with a show of hands. Did anybody notice a difference in class after rolling out hamstrings? Some people, yeah. Yeah, hamstrings are pretty big. Did anybody specifically notice a difference in their turnout after rolling out? This is mainly for people who said outer line. Not really, some yes, some no, kind of. Yeah, that one takes a while, but if the outer line is really tight for you and you notice that makes the biggest difference, your turnout is probably going to start improving the more you roll that out. Okay, so hang on, sorry. Okay, let's move on to the hamstrings. Go ahead and start with the middle hamstring. Okay, yeah. Middle hamstring to start, or you can start with the inner if you feel like that works better. And you can pick which leg, right or left, doesn't matter. We're gonna do both. And remember, you can cross your leg over if you feel like that helps. And we're not going to spend too much time on this today, but still make sure your hamstrings are nice and loose, because hamstrings do have an effect on your glutes and on your hips, because your entire body is connected, and if one thing gets tight, other things will compensate. And let's move to the inner line of the hamstring, turning in just a little bit. And let's move to the outer line of the hamstring, so turning out just a little bit. And when you're ready, turn it in parallel to the ground and roll out your gracilis. And you can spend a little more time closer to the knee as opposed to up in the hip, because we'll do that later. Focus on the muscles closer to you. And when you're ready, you can switch to your IT band. Parallel. And when you feel ready, let's go ahead and switch to the other side. So starting with the middle of the hamstring on your other leg. And when you're ready, turning in slightly and getting the inner hamstring. And again, remember, if you don't have a foam roller, you can massage with your hands. If you have a stick, you could also use that. Sometimes this works. I like the foam roller best though, because your body weight does help when you're trying to pull out your hamstrings. It gives you just a little bit more pressure in the right leg. And turn out and roll out your outer hamstring. And let's go ahead and turn it all the way in and work on the gracilis. So again, if you feel like this is too much pressure on your leg from the foam roller and you have a stick, you're welcome to just roll up here. Or you can use your hands there too. And you can also pound on your leg to release the muscles. And when you feel like you've had enough of that, switch to your IT band. And again, IT bands can be very sensitive, so sometimes a stick works better, or rolling pin. All right, and now let's work a little bit on the glute hamstring connection. So if you have your tennis ball, remember we find a point where our hamstring connects to our glute and we just sit and let it release. Don't roll. Try to let it relax as much as possible. And maybe you stay there for a few deep breaths. And then find another spot to work on a little bit further out. Maybe this is a little tight. Maybe it's a little more inwards. It's different for every person. And let's go ahead and switch to the other leg. Find a point at the top of the hamstring that feels tight and just relax for a little bit. And after a few deep breaths, find another point. And let's do a little bit of stretching. So you can just take a gentle hamstring stretch here. You can do one leg if that feels better. I'm going to start with two legs and then switch to one leg. This doesn't have to be a super deep stretch, just gentle. And let's go ahead and take opposite arm as leg, wrap it around the outside, and you can pull upwards if you like, or you can just stay here and stretch. And let's switch to the other side. Opposite arm is leg, wrap around the outside of the foot. And let's come out of that, and just as a reminder, we're going to do the downward dog stretches that we did last time that stretch both the hamstrings and the calves. So start with your hands on the ground or close to the ground and walk out as far as you can without your heels popping off the floor. So keep your heels down. And from here, rock back a little bit, forward, arch your back, curl and curl your back. And you can rock forward off your calves a little bit. Forward and curl. And arch forward, rock back, curl. This doesn't have to be a huge stretch, just gentle. And if you find this is too much, you can do bicycles, both in a curled back and in an arch back. Or you can do one leg at a time with the arch and curl sets. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to do one leg and then switch to the other leg. And let's walk our hands back where we're comfortable, and either you can stretch with your hands on the ground, you can hold your elbows, you can hold the backs of your legs. Just give yourself a little gravity stretch. So you're letting gravity do the work and your muscles get to relax. And when you're ready, let's bend our knees and come up. All right, moving on to some new stuff. So who has tight hip flexors? Or feels like their hip flexors are tight all the time? Me. Most people. Some people, yeah, some people no. Do you guys know where your hip flexor muscle is located versus where your psoas muscle is located? Some people yes, some people no. Yeah. So hips are a little bit tricky because they're sets of really small muscles that do a lot of work. And actually, when we're dancing, we want to try to put the least amount of effort into those muscles, especially the outer hip flexors, because they're really small. Our psoas is bigger and it attaches into our back, so that can be a lot stronger and do a lot more work. But if you're putting all of the work in your hip flexors, they get really, really tight and they grip, and it hurts a lot. So I'll talk a little bit about how we can sort of access the psoas as opposed to the hip flexors, but for now we're just going to start with rolling them out. Hip flexors and psoas can be very sensitive, so you want to be careful here. But basically, so on yourself, you find your hip bone on both sides or one side, and then straight down from that, you'll feel a muscle. It kind of like, you can kind of feel it almost not quite flipping, but you can feel the muscle there, right? It's not too far in really, it's just straight down from your hip bone. That's the hip flexor muscle that tends to get really tight on a lot of people. We want to figure out how to loosen that up. So one thing actually you can do is just gently, while it's stretched, you don't really want to do this while you're sitting down here because it's in flexion, but while it's open, you can be on your knees or standing, you can just kind of massage in there to loosen it up. But actually this muscle attaches into your quad all the way to your knee. So if this is tight in here, this is going to get really tight in here. So let's actually start by rolling out our quads. If you have a stick, it's really great to start with a stick. If you don't, just go ahead and use your hands and do the same kind of massage thing that we did last time. You can wiggle it, you can pound on it, you can massage it with your hands, but we'll start with the stick if you have one. lot of times when our hip flexors are tight, they prevent us from using our turnout to the fullest extent, because as we're trying to pull and turn out with the back of the hip, this is pulling us inwards. So that's another reason why it's really important to have your hip flexors as loose as possible, is so that when you're trying to use turnout from your proper turnout muscles, the tightness here isn't getting in the way of that. And you can also turn in a little bit. So for the quad, I don't really think about the 3 lines quite as much, but you can just slightly. So you can have the top, you can have the inside, which kind of attaches to the gracilis. It's a much smaller set of 3 lines, and then you can turn in a little bit and kind of have the outside line. We're just going to work on one hip to start with, all of the rolling exercises, and then we're going to compare. Everybody usually has a better hip and a worse hip though, so this might not be the most accurate test. For me, my right hip is a lot better. It's a lot more open, it has a lot less problems. My left one has a lot of problems, but the left side is more flexible for everything else, because the left hip kind of compensates for all the other muscles, so it grips while all the other muscles are loose, which is not really a good thing, but that's just how most bodies are made. You have a muscle that compensates for everything else, it gets really tight. So now that we've done that, if you have a foam roller, if you have a foam roller, find that area right under your hip bone and just gently roll back and forth on that. So you'll kind of lay on your stomach this way, and actually I'm going to show on the other hip so you can see better. Your leg is pretty much straight, parallel to the ground, and you just roll back and forth there. I would not recommend using a tennis ball for your hip flexors, because hips are really sensitive, and a tennis ball is kind of a small object that will put a lot of pressure in one area, and you can end up with bruised hips, and that is no fun. So once you've done that for a little bit, go ahead and turn your leg parallel to the ground and massage on the inside of the hip. This is sort of the top of where your gracilis attaches to the pubic bone, and that area can get really tight too. So if you've ever done your splits square versus open, you'll be able to feel that it's actually 2 different muscles that are being used. So if you're doing a square split where your hip flexor is down towards the ground like in a pigeon, that's using this muscle here. If you're doing an open split like you would for a grand jeté, that is this muscle in here that attaches up in the hip. So both of them are used for different things and need to be loose for different reasons. So it's important to target the inside of your hip as well. The other area that you can get with the roller is kind of on the outside. So you're not fully on your IT band. It's a little bit turned in from that, but it's kind of between your hip flexor and where the side of your hip starts. That area can get really tight too, and we want to make sure that that is rolled out. So that area that we're targeting, if your hip bone is here and your hip flexor is here, it's right next to it, this area right here, like sort of where you put your hands in your pockets, that area. Okay, now we're gonna work on the glutes a little bit. So as most people know, these control a lot of our turnout and the range we have in our turnout. So if all the little muscles in here get tight, it's really hard to find that rotation. So this is sort of similar to the glute hamstring one, where you take the tennis ball and you find a point and you can kind of just sit. But this one, it's actually okay if you would prefer to roll and sort of figure out where it's tight and then roll along those areas. Rolling is not going to really damage anything here, as long as you're putting some weight in your hands and not completely dropping down. So 2 ways you can do this: either find a tight spot and just sit there. You can let your leg open, keep it closed. You can go back on your elbows. You can even lay all the way down and find an area and do some releases there. Usually turning out the one leg over the ball helps. Finding a different point, or sometimes it just feels better to roll with the tennis ball and target different areas of your hip. So go ahead and experiment with that a little bit and see what works better. For me personally, I prefer to roll. I used to do the releases instead, but I found that rolling works better. And you can also go into the very side area of your hip with the tennis ball here and just lay down. And that feels really good and helps open up the side of the hips. So that's another option that you have, or you can roll along that line back and forth. Okay, now let's test a couple stretches. Let's start with a butterfly. See if you feel a difference between the two sides of your body. What I find for hips is that just rolling doesn't always help. I have to roll and then stretch to actually feel the difference in my range, but it may be different for you. And of course, because hips are very sensitive, if you just rolled out your bad hip, you may feel like, oh, it's the same as my good hip. Or if you rolled out your good hip, you may feel, wow, this is a drastic difference, and then not feel as much difference on the other side. So just be aware of that usually most people are a little bit uneven in which side is more flexible. Go ahead and test your pigeon. And test lunge with the knee up and the knee down. And for me, usually I find that these stretches don't feel any easier after I roll. They kind of hurt just as much, but I notice that my range is a little better. I can go a little bit lower, etc. And then you can try turning in, or you can try the other leg because you just stretched out your glute. Here, I feel a huge difference. This doesn't hurt anywhere near as much as it did before I rolled it. And then you can also test with the leg on top that you just rolled out, either full glute stretch or higher log pose. So before we go to the other side, go ahead and type in the chat box if you felt a difference and where. Over here, guys. Hip flexor. Ava, is that in, did you feel that help in the pigeon stretch the most? Or the lunge? Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? And some people won't feel a difference. If your hips are very open and flexible, you might not feel anything, and that's okay. A little bit of difference in the quads, yeah. Hip flexor. Did anybody notice, actually, I forgot to have you guys test also the range turned out, sorry. So if you're stretching your hip flexor this way, also test pigeon stretch open. Does anybody feel a difference there with your range of turnout in a stretch? It doesn't have to be standing, it can be a pigeon or a split, but with the back leg instead of turned in being turned out. Does anybody feel a difference there? Quads. Glute. Yeah. Everybody go ahead and test your side that you didn't roll out and just see if you feel a difference. And I want you guys to also, I forgot to have you do this one before. So with our pigeon turned in, I want you guys to also test it turned out like you'd be doing an arabesque, because that's stretching more here as opposed to in here. So just test both sides and feel the difference. I feel a really big difference right here in this stretch. And stretch your lunge. You can even test your splits if you like. If you have trouble with your splits, usually it's either your hamstrings or your hips, hip flexors specifically, that are tight. Yeah. Does anybody notice a difference between the two sides? Thumbs up if you notice a difference. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Let's go ahead and do the other side. So starting with finding where your hip flexor is from your hip bone straight down and just rolling on that with, actually, sorry, quad. We did quads first. Forgot about that. Starting with rolling out quad. I think I did different sides for different things. So rolling along the top and along the inner line of the quad and the outer line of the quad as you need. Or massaging with your hands. This one, if I don't have a foam roller, I usually end up doing this. And that feels pretty good. Also using your hands works as well too. So once you've done that, go ahead and find where your hip flexor is and start rolling along the top. And you can roll all the way into your quad too here, if that feels good. Sometimes it's a little bit too intense to roll on your quad with the foam roller, but it's all very personal. And when you're ready, go ahead and work on the inner part of the hip. It attaches to the gracilis. This is going to help. This specifically helps with the range in your arabesque and soda shot or any kind of split jumps. Because if you think about it, if this muscle in here is tight and you're trying to do an arabesque, you're trying to get your hip down, keep a square arabesque, it's just going to pull it inwards and it's going to pull it down, as opposed to if it's open, you're able to turn out more, you're able to get range in here when you start lifting your leg. So that's why it's important to work on this in here, as it helps that line. And also work on the area just outside the hip flexor, sort of where your pockets would be if you were wearing pants with pockets. And you'll find that sometimes you use your arms for leverage to push you back and forth. Sometimes you find that you use your foot to push you back and forth. Different things work for different people. I noticed that my arms actually got a lot stronger after I started rolling because I used them for leverage. And when you're ready, go ahead, take your tennis ball and find an area of your glutes that's tight. And either you can roll back and forth, or you can lay down and do a pressure point release. Or you could do both. Sometimes you do a pressure point release for a little bit, and then you roll that spot out. And you may want to spend a lot longer rolling out this area or doing a pressure point release than you have time for. So that's something to experiment with on your own. Just seeing if it works and if it helps. This is really great if you have one of those days where no matter what you do, how many stretches you do, butterfly, glute, whatever, and you feel like you just can't get your turnout, your range of turnout that you normally have, this will save your life. Just in between bar combinations, if your teacher allows you to roll out between combinations, or even right before class, checking your range and then seeing if you can access a little bit more. And let's go ahead, and if you feel like this is helpful, either lay on the side or roll out along the side of the head. Okay, go ahead and test your range on that side. Oh, that's okay. Thanks, Sarah and Charlie. How should you roll out the hip flexor if you don't have a foam roller? Good question. So that is mostly just massage. You'll find your hip flexor and you can kind of just squeeze and massage back and forth if you don't have a foam roller. You can use your thumb sometimes, or several fingers at once, or you can go like this. Actually, this is really helpful if you do this, especially on the sides. If you find that you're tight in class and the teacher's giving combination and you don't have time to roll out or get your ball or whatever, you can just stand there and do this on your hip flexors, on the sides of your hips, and sometimes this helps a lot. Okay, so testing your range, test your pigeon, test it turned out. If you tested your splits, you can do that. I want everybody to test this stretch also and see if they feel a little bit more range, a little bit more width here. Test your lunge, both with the knee down and with the knee up. You can test the turn in range and the other side. Test your glutes. Test your butterfly. Yeah, for me, I feel a big difference here. Not so much this one because my hip is really messed up, so it doesn't really move whatever I do. But yeah, anybody notice anything that stands out to them as something that really helped. Whether it was a rolling or a certain kind of stretch that changed. Maybe your pigeon stretch got a lot deeper, maybe your lunge got deeper. Just curious. I see some people. Anything that felt different. It could even be a tiny little thing, like something feels a little less sore. Pigeon and straddle, yeah. Kinsey, was that the inner hip or the outer, like the glute that you felt more? Inner, yeah. Straddle split, yeah, that one changes a lot for me too, based on whether I roll out or not. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys a stretch that you can do to get into your psoas, because it's not a good idea to roll out your psoas yourself. That's the muscle that attaches up inside your hip bone and also attaches in your back. And it kind of just like wraps all the way through. And to access that, you can roll out your back actually, and that will help that be less tight, but there's an even better way to just gently stretch it that doesn't involve rolling and is pretty safe. So, sorry, I'm gonna tilt this down so you guys can see. This, if you have a foam roller, a yoga block, books, a pillow, anything that you can put under your hips, this is helpful. You can also do this without something under your hips, but you might not feel it, especially if you're very loose. So basically what you want to do is put something under your hips and you'll feel sort of a stretch in the front of your body. And then make sure this foot down here stays parallel. You can flex it, you can point it. I usually find flexing it works better. But if you let it turn out, you're not going to get that deep stretch in your psoas. So you want to make sure it's turned parallel. You might have to actually use your muscles. It's an active stretch. And then pull your other leg towards you. And this gets really, really deep into your hip muscles and helps to open it up. And it helps even more if you think about reaching your heel away from you while you're pulling, so there's some opposition. Almost everybody will feel this in some way. And some people might have to pull this leg in more than other people. But the most important thing is to make sure you're not letting this leg rotate outwards, that it stays completely parallel. And you can also do this if you don't have a foam roller, just right here. But if you're loose enough, you're not going to feel the stretch here that much. So it's better to have something under your hips to prop it up. And go ahead and try it with the other leg also. I really, really recommend flexing your foot here because it helps you sort of keep it parallel and then have some energy reaching away, as opposed to when you point your foot, you lose some of that pushing energy from your heel. And make sure you're also not curving into your back like this, because when you're curling, you're losing some of the stretch here. You actually want to be in an arch. It doesn't have to be a forced arch either, but you're not letting this collapse in here. Reaching away. And actually, I do want everybody to test splits and straddle after this, because this can make a huge, huge difference, especially in arabesque, actually, because once again, everything is connected. And arabesque is a really big position that uses the entire front of your body in a really stretched out way, whether you're turned in or parallel or whatever, there's a really long line this way. And when your psoas is tight, it shortens this line here. It means the leg can't go as high. It means you can't extend out as well. It just gets really crunched in. So when this is extended, you're lengthened here and you have more space here. So everybody just go ahead and try your splits and see how it feels. You can try it turned out and turned in. And usually people will be more flexible either turned out or turned in. I find that on one side, I'm more flexible turned out, and on the other side, I'm more flexible turned in. It's very weird. Like here, I'm more flexible turned in, but if I turn out, I can't go as far. So it's just very different for everyone. And of course, be gentle with yourself. And try your straddle too. The psoas might not have as much as an effect on this, but for some people it will, because you are sort of lengthening all the muscles in this area. And before we go, because we're almost done, I want to show you guys one more stretch that you can do to open up the inner hip area. And it's basically you're in a second position plie, sort of. So it's like you're doing this with your feet flexed, except you're turning it on the ground and you're letting gravity do the work. And rocking forward and back very gently can help. But another thing that I find helps even more is if you shift your feet and rock back, rock forward, bring them together. Shift your feet, rock back, come forward, bring them together. And you kind of switch and switch and switch. And that's giving you a really gentle sort of pulse in the inner hip spine. So that is it for today. We are out of time. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type those quickly, but if you don't have any questions, you're welcome to go. Thank you very much. Get some rest this weekend, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. How do you safely roll out your back? We'll talk a little bit more about back next week. We're going to do back and shoulders, but you can pretty much just roll on a foam roller straight on your back, and that should be pretty safe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.